Hello again and welcome back to Module 3 of Project Academy's PMP Scrum Practice Guide. And in this module, I'm going to discuss a little more on the Scrum Lifecycle, particularly focusing on what's known as Extended Scrum. So lots to do here. Let's get stuck in straight away. Okay, so here is a big picture of what's known as Extended Scrum. Let me walk you through it from left to right, and we'll pick up on what I showed you as the Scrum framework partway through. So starting top left, you have something called the vision or vision statement. And let me again remind you of why Extended Scrum is necessary. If you just had a project which took a series of requirements and used those to feed the product backlog and drive a whole bunch of sprints and increments, you've got to remember that such projects are being run within a commercial environment and that even Scrum projects need funding. Plus, you need to make sure that since resources are scarce within an organisation, human and otherwise, it's important to make sure that there's a good business justification for carrying this out and that senior management are prepared to put their money where their mouth is. So step one is a vision saying, as you can see, the goals for the project and its alignment with the organisation's strategy. I'll show you exactly what these look like in a moment. That would make sense, wouldn't it, to at least give the confidence to management that this is worth carrying out. Having got the vision, step number 2 is called the product roadmap. And yes, it's not very often created using post-it notes. It's a great way to do it, just like traditional project planning. And what this is a holistic view of the product features that create the product vision. The roadmap, therefore, could be seen as a hierarchy of all of the features. And yes, you'd be right if you think that the product roadmap will feed directly the requirements, the user stories, and hence the product backlog. But before we can do that, we've got step 3, which is called release planning. Now, if you remember, at the end of each sprint, you'd have what's known as a potentially releasable product. Well, it's the release of those and in which sequence that is derived from release planning, where yes, you'll create a release plan. And as I said here, release timing for each specific product and or functionality. And Scrum being Scrum, of course, this is not dyed in wool, fixed in stone and so on. It's highly likely that although the vision should remain consistent, but that the product roadmap and release planning will constantly refine as the sprints are carried out. So this is where we can join our story of what I've told you thus far. Although not necessary to show on this diagram, from release planning, you would now create your first version, your first prioritization, if you will, of your product roadmap. And it's from that, within step 4, sprint planning, where you break each requirement or feature down and work out what the work efforts needed for each and the sequence in which the products need to be made. As I've said here, it's where you establish specific iteration goals and the tasks or activities. Yes, just like a traditional project, Scrum takes the features or requirements and works out a mini plan, if you will, of how to do them and in what sequence. And depending on the nature of the sprint, it would be quite usual as part of sprint planning to produce a small schedule showing these activities and the sequence in which they need to be carried out in order to create potentially shippable products at the end of the sprint. During each sprint, as you now know, you have your daily Scrum, the stand-up meeting, used to establish and coordinate priorities of the day. Like I say, don't confuse this with a status meeting. This is to make sure the team have everything they need and they've got the right focus to continue to move towards meeting the sprint goal. You also know step 6, since we've covered it, and that's the sprint review. Typically a demonstration of a working product, usually a part working product, and it might just be the demonstration of the braking system or the dashboard layout and so on and so forth. Just a memo for later, the sprint review is not only about demonstrating the working product, certainly one of the most important aspects, but it'll also, of course, be inspect and adapt. Do you remember that? One of the bedrock principles of Scrum, so that we can work out what we've got, get immediate feedback, and adapt the work activities for the remainder of that sprint. Then at the end of the sprint also, and steps 6 and 7 may occur almost one after the other, very close to each other. So sprint retrospective is about looking at the process and its refinement of the environment of developing the various products and the processes to make sure we optimize efficiency and effectivity. At that point, we could potentially release a product, as per, of course, your release plan, which you created back here in step 3. As a result of doing that, you will almost certainly want to update the release plan and thereby show the releases that are planned to follow, possibly on a different time frame. So there's the big picture then of extended Scrum. Let's now look at step 1 and 2 for the remainder of this module. So the project charter and the team. Now every project does need a project charter, and there are many other names for the project charter. Your project terms of reference is one name, a project brief is another, and so on. But I'll call it project charter. What this is for and why it's important is so that the project team knows why this project matters, where the team is headed, and what the project objective or objectives are. The bit about why this project matters could normally be seen as an outline business case, explaining why it's worth using this time and resources to develop the end products, and why the benefits outweigh cost and risk. However, when it comes to agile teams, they also require how the team will work together. So you might see the name Team Charter. How's that different to Project Charter? Well, I've explained the first. Team Charter is understanding what the norms and how they will work together. If you like, laying out the guidelines to make sure that they are a cohesive, effective team. So the Team Charter is how the team members interact with each other to work to the best of their ability as a team. Back to the Project Charter then. As a minimum for an agile project, the team needs a project vision or purpose and a clear set of working agreements. So an agile project charter answers these questions. Why are we doing this project? This is the project vision. 2, who benefits from this project and how will they benefit? Now this might become part of the project vision and or the project purpose. Don't worry about all these terms with the word project. We're talking about the same objective. They're all for the same purpose. 3, what does done mean for the project? These are what are known as the project's release criteria. I'll talk much more about that in a later module. As part of agreeing the project charter and the project vision, and indeed the project roadmap, there needs to be a definition of done needs to be determined. As I say, more of that later. And 4th, how are we going to work together? This is where the team charter comes into play. And this explains also the intended flow of work. Because how do we need to work together doesn't just mean the specialist team. It may well be how the specialist team works with other departments or groups. Maybe even external departments or groups. So let me show you a great graphic on what the project vision is about. First of all, let me cast your eyes over here. Do you remember I've talked about user stories being one way to represent requirements or features? That's what we're talking about here. Below that, you have something called tasks or activities. These are the tasks that the Scrum team undertake during the sprint themselves. So at the lowest level, we have tasks. These are determined by the Scrum team alone and not by the product owner, and they're not included within the product backlog. It's only the stories or features or requirements, if you will, that are contained within the prioritized product backlog. Do you remember I said at the top of the product backlog, you'd have the finer details, the well thought through features, and as you go down the product backlog towards the bottom, those features may not be fully understood yet. Indeed, they might be quite large because we don't have enough information to break them down into smaller enough chunks to become suitable for use on sprints. These are sometimes called epics. So epics are a temporary version of basically one big large feature which we don't know enough yet to break it down further. But looking at the yellow parts of the pyramid, we have the vision at the top, and the vision is broken down to what is sometimes called the theme, usually drawn out within the product roadmap. Okay, let's follow this across to the right. I think it's now fairly self-explanatory. You know that Scrum uses anything from tasks up to epics, and that the vision or theme, if you will, represents the big picture, the end product, and encapsulates the scope of the project itself. Here's these big epics that would sit at the bottom of the project roadmap, of the product roadmap. And what you would want to be doing is breaking epics down into stories, and as part of sprint planning, breaking down each story or feature into its relevant tasks. So keep a mental note of this graphic. It's not that hard, but it gives you the big picture of how we start at visions, themes, and product roadmaps right the way through to carrying out activities within the sprints and delivering valuable customer products and benefits. So let's check out the vision to start with. Called the vision statement, or just the vision. What it represents is your stable strategic destination, a vision of the future, if you will. So the vision statement is not part of the basic Scrum model, but the concept is useful, and frankly, out there in the real world of Agile, it's widely used and adopted. The vision statement should be crisp, concise, and clear, articulating the end goal. The vision statement would normally be a few sentences or a few paragraphs at most. And this, of course, is step one in extended Scrum that I showed you, capturing the goals for the project and how that aligns with the organization's strategy. If you're in the widget making business, then you'd expect your Scrum project to be in some way related to the creation of new and better widgets. So a vision statement should be internally focused, no fluff or padding whatsoever. Its use is for the Scrum team itself. And this vision statement shows the what. It does not show you how you're going to do it, which is why it can be crisp, concise, and clear. As I've said, no longer than 2 or 3 sentences typically, and the vision statement will help define the project end product. So here's how one might look, and there is a fairly standard template for use, and I'm putting that into play here. So let's go through it together. For, and this is where you name your target solution, for example, for our restaurant owners, and then who, a statement of the need, who need a system for preparing and delivering takeaway food. The, and here's where you give the product name, the food takeaway process, if that's what you're creating here, and it is some form of product category. It could be a document, or it could be a template in and of itself, or it could be a piece of software or hardware or what have you. That, and here's where you give it the outcome, the key benefit from this end product of your project, and the compelling reason why you'd want to buy it or invest in it or use it. Continuing, unlike, and this is where you say either the current situation or a competitor. Remember what you're doing here, you're solving a problem, the statement of the need, okay? And then continue, our product, that's this new product for your targeted customer, which supports our strategy too, and this might be provide speedy turnaround times for customers that turn up at our restaurants and want to take food out. Got the idea? And you'll find this is a lot easier if you simply copy this down and think about a project or an assignment that you need to carry out and try and write your own vision statement just once. It'll cement this structure in your head. Again, it's just a guideline to make sure you've covered all the bases. Going back to what I said here, the vision statement should be crisp, concise, and clear. And having a little template helps make sure you achieve that. So what about the product roadmap then? Well, it's not a formal aspect of Scrum, yet again, as I've said, but it is common practice within the Agile industry. Why do you need this? Well, you need to know where you're going with your project, otherwise you'll just wander aimlessly. Now, if I had to take a very small dig to pure Scrum projects, it's just that you take a list of requirements and the Scrum team have at it, converting them into the product backlog, carrying out sprints and very efficiently and effectively delivering those products. But you need to understand what products and for what purpose. So that's where the roadmap, the extended Scrum, comes into its own. This, of course, is step 2, as I've said. It's where you decide where you want to go, which is the vision, which we've done in the previous slide, and then you figure out how to get there, which is the product roadmap itself. Very often done as a graphic diagram, created using post-it notes. It's a popular way of doing that. Whipping out your smartphone, taking a nice detailed picture of it, and using that to drive the way forward. So the product roadmap is a high-level view of your vision statement. Features. We know about features now. They get ruthlessly prioritized in the product backlog. And by the way, each of these features are called product backlog items, PBI. I will mention that again. So if you see PBIs, they're each individual feature within a product backlog. So the product roadmap is your initial product backlog. It is, because we haven't made that yet, have we? But instead of having a ruthlessly ordered list, we've just got an early set of features and the sequence in which you need to release them. So here's a picture of our product backlog, a ruthlessly ordered to-do list, as you know, and the development team will need to be involved with building the roadmap. Who owns the product roadmap? It's the product owner. Fairly easy to remember that. And although the product roadmap is entirely the responsibility of the product owner, they will want the development team to get involved. Why? Because they have specialist knowledge. They'll be able to give useful early feedback on why, for example, feature C should be the third feature and A should be the first, or whether a feature down here should be for future sprints as yet unplanned. So the product backlog is a Scrum artifact, as they say, and a master to-do list for the entire project. Product backlog is owned and maintained by the product owner. And as you just seen, it's got full involvement from the other roles, that's the development team and indeed the Scrum Master. Remember, the product owner will be working very closely and will represent the customer and will be held responsible for delivering the products and providing benefits and value to the customer in the most efficient and effective manner. So we take the requirements from the product roadmap initially to create the so-called product backlog. Now, you see, not all items in a product backlog will be at the same level of detail, as I've said, at the same time. So these product backlog items, features if you will, that you will need to work on soon should be near the top of the backlog. These will be small in size, very detailed, so that they can be worked on in a near-term sprint. Whereas product backlog items that we won't or can't work on for some time should be near the bottom. These will be larger in size and less detailed. That's okay, because we'll get to those details at a later point. And some of the drivers of taking the requirements and putting them near the top or the middle or the bottom is to do with clarity. Are there any features that are already very clearly understood? These will be candidates for the top of the product roadmap. So when it comes to the product roadmap, the requirements that would go near the top of the product backlog will be those where there's clarity. We have a good understanding of exactly what the requirements are, where the acceptance criteria is already fairly detailed, and where the features have already been sized and decomposed, meaning split down into small features that would be ready for sprints. And by sized, of course, this is estimating each feature. Now, we'll cover that in a much later module when we look at estimating. And clearly here, we'd want to make sure that each requirement was of a sufficient size to be included within a sprint. If it's not, they would go towards the bottom of the product backlog, and on the time frame of the roadmap be those that you'll carry out later. Also remember, there's risks. You'd want to identify what risks there are to delivering certain features. You may want to carry those out first so we can reduce risk. And the other consideration is mitigated risks. What that simply means is taking actions to reduce risks, either in terms of their probability or likelihood, or in terms of their impact. And again, to help mitigate such risks, you may want to carry out those features earlier rather than later. Remember, saving up risks so we don't know what we're going to do about them until later is a recipe for disaster. So here's an example of what a product roadmap might look like, and here you can see each of the requirements, if you will. We've put them in strict, ruthlessly prioritized order, and here's number 1, here's number 2, here's number 3. They're just examples. We'd want to give them a unique ID. That's helpful, isn't it? So that we can refer to them in any of our discussions or documentation. And here we describe what the requirement is. And this is where you'd start to use something called user stories. And again, I don't want to get into that just now, but here's an example anyway. As an administrator, this is obviously a user of some feature or features that you're going to turn into one or more products. I want to link accounts with 2 profiles so that the customers can access new accounts. What type of requirement is this? Well, it's a requirement. Its status is it's not started yet, and we have an estimate of 8 somethings. I'll talk about what that is. It could be work hours, but it's more likely to be something called story points, which we'll get into at a later point. Here's requirement number 2 on your product roadmap. ID is number 122. As a customer, I want to transfer money between my active accounts so that I can adjust each account's balance. This is an improvement type rather than a requirement. Again, not started. And then 3, here's another type of requirement. Update requirements for its ability matrix. Whatever that is, it doesn't matter. This is an overhead feature. And again, it's not yet started. So just a quick introduction here to some of the language that's used. You'll understand these better as we dive into detail within requirements and user stories later. So again, that's a good place to stop. And my objective of Module 3 was to give you a flavour of the entire extended Scrum lifecycle, so that in the coming modules, as we dive into more detail, you can put this within context. So, thanks again for your time and attention. Do join me on Module 4, where I will introduce you to Scrum activities and Scrum artifacts. Thanks for your time and attention. From me, David. Bye for now.